All right, let's talk about John. Mr. McManus and I and Bill became acquainted, I think, back in the fall. I'm a proud member of John Birch Society. I have to tell you, when I was a kid in high school, a few years ago, I was not particularly politically connected. Bill was more than I was. But I remember, oh, John Birch Society, they're scary. Well, now that I'm a little bit more smart, maybe, I've attended a number of their meetings, and I've read and I've become informed myself about what's going on in this world. And there are things that John Birch talks about that are really important and critical to our safety and the future of this country that nobody else talks about. And I'd urge you to look at their literature and to attend their meetings when you can. And Kip has them in this area, in this very hall. I think Thursday he's got one. But so we very much appreciate John coming down from Massachusetts for us and being here. And I think we have a really great evening. Just tell you how we're going to operate tonight. We're going to present a video of Michael Farris, who is with Convention of the States. He was invited here, but when he found out I wouldn't run the meeting as he wanted it in a formal debate style, he rescinded his acceptance of our invitation. So what we have is a 30-minute video, which is on the Convention of the States site, so you can go home and watch it or send it to a friend if you'd like to inform them of it. We're going to watch that first. Bill, I think somewhere you have also the Article 5 from the Constitution, which probably a lot of you have read, right? But it might not be a bad idea just to spend a minute and reread it, because this is going to be the subject of our conversation tonight. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So most of the conventions have gotten passed how? By Congress, right, okay. But the states, if 2/3 of them can, yeah, right, right. It's not been done this way by the states at all, ever. So, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states. So an amendment has to be ratified, has to go out and be ratified, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress.
Thank you, Barbara. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to start off by saying I'm not a lawyer. Mr. Farris talked about the Equal Rights Amendment, and some of you will remember that it had a 7-year duration to try to get ratification by the states and so on, and it didn't succeed, and then they came back and they added 2.5 more years, and it still didn't work. He forgot to mention that the John Birch Society was the reason it didn't work. Right? But it certainly was, and I was involved in that, and I know we sent speakers around the world, around the country, and we sent all kinds of literature on the subject and so on. To ignore that, I think it's too bad. Now, I think you all know who Jay Leno is. Okay? I can remember a few years ago that Jay Leno came out with one absolutely wonderful remark. They were talking in Washington about putting together a constitution for Iraq. And he said, why don't we give them ours? We're not using it. I understand. I never watched the show. I'm never up that late. I don't care for it anyhow. But anyhow, he also said that I guess the last night that he was on the air, he said the real big problem with leaving this job is that now I have to apply for Obamacare. So, Common Core was mentioned. Barbara mentioned it, and I know that in New Jersey here now you've lost your Secretary of Education. You poor folks. I'm so sorry for you. Let me boil it down. What is Common Core? Common Core is making drones for the New World Order out of our children. That's what it's all about. They're not going to teach them literature, they're not going to teach them history, they're not going to teach them the things that they need to know. Now, we're getting a little far afield here, but I just couldn't resist adding that. Now, I put together a PowerPoint presentation here, and I want you to know that you're all guinea pigs because this is the first. It's the first time I've done this. So let's get right into it. A Constitutional Convention, we call it Under a Microscope, presented by me. Now, lost awareness here. Let's just give a little philosophical point. America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. Right? And that's kind of been lost. It's a very important concept, and we want very much to bring it back. Now, the U.S. Constitution has been looked upon by a lot of people over the course of the years. William Gladstone was the Prime Minister of England in the 1860s, and he said, "It's the greatest piece of work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man." That's nice to hear, right? I have this thing about the British, but every once in a while there's a Brit that's pretty good, I guess. Now, John MacDonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada, again in the 1860s. And he said, "I think and believe that it is one of the most perfect organizations that ever governed a free people." Right? Now, that's pretty high praise from some pretty important people in their time. And there are lots more, but I just picked out those two. Now, what is the value of the Constitution? Right? We want to preserve it. We're very much in favor of the Constitution in this John Birch Society. And there are two big reasons. One is that the Constitution is a standard by which to measure performance of elected officials. Now, we publish a Freedom Index in our New American Magazine, and we rate all 435 members of the House and all 100 members of the Senate. And we rate them based on their adherence to the constitutional oath that they've all taken. Now, you can imagine that some of them get 0. Quite a few. I've been exposed here as a resident of Massachusetts. Yes, it's true. Right? I always tell people I like to work behind enemy lines, right? Massachusetts is a disgrace as far as its congressional representation. New Jersey, you have a couple that lean a little bit farther to the right, a little bit more obeying their oath, but not many, right? And then you can go to a place like Oklahoma where you've got tremendous support for the Constitution. So the standard to measure them is the Constitution. And it's not what they say when they want to get elected. It's not what they posture as. It's what they do when they actually make the votes. And we publish the results. And I know many, many times we've heard from a member of the society who's gone to what? Did I do that? Has gone to one of these meetings where a congressman comes to meet the people, and a guy will stand up and he says, "Well, it says right here in this Freedom Index is what we call it," and as soon as he says Freedom Index, the congressman goes like this, you know, right? How did that guy get in here? But we publish it in the magazine, we make reprints of it and so forth, and we urge everybody to take a look. I think we got some on the table there. Okay. Now, so it's a standard, and then the second thing is, it's a restrainer of government's always voracious power grabbing. Now, on that, I'm certainly in agreement with Mr. Farris. That's what he said. I agree. And I agree with a lot of what he said. But I don't want a constitutional convention. Right? Now, let's show you how bad it can get. The very first sentence in the Constitution, after the preamble, "All legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States." So all lawmaking powers in Congress. No lawmaking power via presidential executive orders, which goes on all the time. No lawmaking via court decisions. Now let me give you just one example of each of the violations here. presidential executive orders. How many of you know that the Environmental Protection Agency was not a law passed by Congress, but was an executive order issued by Richard Nixon? Okay? All right, not too many, but some. All right, how about Roe versus Wade? The Supreme Court outlawing restrictions on abortion, and 55 million victims of that horrible decision. So lawmaking power is in Congress. And the fact that Congress will not stop lawmaking by executive orders or lawmaking by the Supreme Court indicts them. Right? All right, what else? Abuses and dereliction of duty, going on all the time. War power is only in Congress. Haven't used the war power, no declaration of war since right after Pearl Harbor in 1941. The power to coin money is in the Constitution, and it's Congress's power, but it's to coin money, not issue it. Big distinction. Right? They set up a mint. They took the gold and the silver of the people and they stamped it into coinage of a fixed size, weight, and value. And that's all that was allowed. It was never the purpose of the federal government to issue money. And then in 1913 they came along and say, well, we have this power and we're going to delegate it to the new Federal Reserve. Well, delegation of power is also unconstitutional. Right? Okay, now, abuses and derelicts. How about protect the states from invasion? Is that in the Constitution? Yes, it is. Right? Right? Isn't 11 or 20 million people coming across the southern border? Isn't that an invasion? Now, the Constitution didn't say military invasion. It just said invasion. And that's an invasion, and that's a duty of God. They're not doing it. Dereliction of duty. And of course, they ignore the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment, which I always say is that Congress, the Bill of Rights is Congress shall not, all the way up to the marvelous 10th. It says if we forgot anything, you can't do that either. Right? So, there are people who want to get rid of the Constitution. They claim to want improvement. They want to open it up for complete overhaul, however. Right? Not that Farris wants to open it up for complete overhaul, but some people do. And they want to call for a constitutional convention, a CONCON. I'll refer to it throughout this as CONCON, Constitutional Convention. Now, ratification by the states. There are people who say the safety valve is that whatever comes out of a constitutional convention has to then go through ratification by the states. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the Articles of Confederation required unanimous approval of the states, 13. Out of the convention that did away with the Articles of Confederation and gave us the Constitution, the ratification procedure was now 9 states, not 13. Right? And so a constitutional convention can dicker with the number of states to ratify, including going all the way down to none. A constitutional convention is its own boss. It can do what it pleases. And that's a very important concept. It seems to be forgotten by some people. Ratification by the states, the 1787 CONCON, that was supposed to only to alter the Articles of Confederation. But it changed the requirement from unanimous approval of the states to only 3/4 of the states needed. And another constitutional convention can say, we don't need ratification of any of the states. Or half, or 1/3, or whatever. Right? The point I'm making is that a CONCON is not limited. Once it convenes, it is a sovereign body. And that's why we've never had another one in the 200 and how many years? What is it? 230 some odd years now? All right, Article 5, 2 procedures are permitted. First procedure, a convention called by the states for proposing amendments must be ratified by 3/4 of the states. The second procedure is a convention for proposing amendments plus ratification by 3/4 of the states. So it can start out from the states or it can start out from the convention. Right? And now there's a new proposal that's being made now, which says that there shall only be, they want to amend Article 5. Before they get to a constitutional convention, they want to amend Article 5. And it says only 2 delegates per state, and then it says delegates shall consider only a single previously agreed upon amendment, identical wording from each state. Okay, now, I don't have any problem with that, except that I don't want to see any more amendments to the Constitution, except a couple of amendments to cancel previous amendments. Okay? Some of you will know that at one point in time there was an article against an article that enforced prohibition against the use of alcohol, right? And only a few years later there was another amendment to cancel that one. So we have 27 amendments to the Constitution, but we really only have 25 because one canceled out the other, and now we only, so 2 of them canceled each other. 25 amendments in 225 years or whatever, it's a pretty good record, I'd say. Right? And some of those amendments, what I'd like to see, I'd love to see the direct election of senators done away with. Yeah. Go back to states. States appointing the senators to be guardians of the state power against the federal government, which is what was intended. And then the other one I'd love to see gone is the income tax. Right? Yeah. Well, the Federal Reserve was not an amendment. Federal Reserve was an act of Congress. And that we are now 100 years of Federal Reserve, and we've gone from a dollar worth 100 cents down to a dollar worth 2 cents. Yeah, that's right. All right, now, there are myths about a con-con. Proponents of a con-con claim that a convention of the states is not a con-con. That's one of the things that I disagree very much with Mr. Farris, right? He's calling it a convention of the states. What is it? It's a con-con. It's a constitutional convention. Right? Now, he says that the states can control a con-con. He said a con-con can be limited. No. It wasn't limited in 1787, which is why there never was another one. State ratification process will bar mischief, but the state ratification process can be altered and even done away with. And a constitution can't change the whole constitution? No, it can. It can't throw it out, as they threw out the Articles of Confederation in the only constitutional convention this country has ever endured. So all of those myths, they're all false, and they are myths. Questions. How to choose the delegates? How many delegates per state? Expenses. Who will pay for the people to go to the Constitutional Convention? Who will be the chairman? Nancy Pelosi, maybe. Where to hold the con-con? The safety of the delegates. Who will be in charge of, you've got to expect that there'll be demonstrations, you've got to expect, especially in these days, we see this kind of thing happening all the time. Well, the answer is in Article 5, the Congress has the power to call a convention for proposing amendments. And at the end of Article 1, Section 8 in the Constitution, it grants power to Congress to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers in Section 8, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. Article 5 tells us that Congress has the power to set the rules should there be a constitutional convention. I'm amazed that Michael Farris didn't mention that. That is a very important point. Congress shall do. All right, now, the Congress that we have today, who will they select to be the chairman of the Constitutional Convention? Harry Reid. Okay, all right. Anybody else want to suggest somebody? Right? Nancy Pelosi. Right? But who will be, all right, let's say John Boehner. Oh. John Boehner, you got a suggestion?
Yeah, well, I'm going to disagree with you because the Constitution, The Congress that's in place today would never call a convention.
The Congress today would never call a convention. So we're talking about what might happen here. Again and again, we're talking about what might happen. But keep in mind that the Constitution itself says that Congress has the power to carry into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution. One of the powers vested in this Constitution is that Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. The Congress has that power. Okay, now, who favors a con-con? All right? I think a lot of people I call quick fix artists, right? They want a quick fix. We got a big problem in this country, and I don't disagree with Michael Farris about the problem, right? Mark Levin's The Liberty Amendments. How many in the room have read Mark Levin's book? Oh, good number, okay. So you know what I'm talking about. I think that certainly he favors a constitutional convention, no matter what he calls it. Then we have Limbaugh and Hannity and Beck. They support the Constitutional Convention. The National Tax Limitation Committee does. The National Taxpayers Union, headed by Lou Euler, a fellow I've known for many, many years. The Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, they're in favor of a Constitutional Convention.
They're behind the Convention of States. That's
right.
Yeah.
Michael Farris of Patrick Henry College, we've already met him. Tea Party Patriots, that's Mark Meckler. And there's a group called Wolfpack. Not too many have heard of Wolfpack, financed by a fellow named George Soros. Well, a lot of people have heard of George Soros. Leftists who favor a con-con. This is surprising. Now, you've got leftists. The Young Turks, right? They're part of the Wolfpack group. And then there's the Alliance for Democracy. I've written a little treatise called A Republic If You Can Keep It, pointing out that our country is a republic, not a democracy. Our government system is a republic, not a democracy. And Robert Welsh coined a phrase years ago, and we even had it on bumper stickers. This is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. The republic being the rule of law, the democracy being the rule of a majority, the mob. Right? It's very simple. We have those on the book table?
Yes, I have.
Okay, we got them right there. All right, who else favors a con-con? Code Pink, right? Independent Progressive Network. Progressive is a modern term for socialist. Right? The Sierra Club favors a con-con. Vermont for single payer. They want medical care, the Obama kind, right? They're the ones that send an admitted socialist to the U.S. Senate, Bernie Sanders. Right? So there are a lot of people on both sides of what you might call the political spectrum who are in favor of a con-con. Who are the opponents of a con-con? Well, James Madison is. Thomas Jefferson is. Phyllis Schlafly's already been mentioned. Former Justice Warren Burger. Former Justice Arthur Goldberg. The late Judge Robert Bork. Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard, Professor Charles Rice of Notre Dame, Professor Gerald Gunther of Stanford, Professor Thomas Everson of Yale, and the John Birch Society. Right. I hate to say this, but Michael Farris has on a couple of occasions recently said that the John Birch Society is an enemy of the Constitution. That's quite an insult. There are more opponents of the con-con. These are lefties now. We get the American Civil Liberties Union, the American Federation of Teachers, Americans for Democratic Action, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the NAACP, National Organization for Women, People for the American Way. Some of these groups worry that the Bill of Rights might be canceled, right? That's why the ACLU is involved in this thing, right? And they are opponents of a constitutional convention. So you got people all over the place, for and against this. Here's what Warren Burger said. The participants in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 had no authority to write a constitution. They were authorized only to revise the Articles of Confederation. But when they got to Philadelphia, they paid no attention to those limits and wisely threw the whole thing away and wrote the Constitution, right? Now that challenges what Michael Farris said, right? But Warren Burger's correct on that, and we've shown lots of people what he said, and he had been the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He isn't opposed to amendments. He expressed his opposition to a constitutional convention that would have power to void the entire Constitution. That's what he was opposed to. Right? Now, good amendments, I've already mentioned this. I'd like to see repeal of 16, the direct election of senators, and 17, repeal the federal income tax. You know, years ago there was a fellow named Willis Stone. How many remember, have ever heard of Willis Stone? Well, Willis Stone was a constitutional expert, and he came up with what he called the Liberty Amendment. And he tried to get the Liberty Amendment, tried to attract people to want to support the Liberty Amendment. And the Liberty Amendment was very short. It had only 3 articles. Right? The first one said, the federal government is hereby prohibited from involvement in any business enterprise in competition with private enterprise. The second item said we would save so much money doing that that we could do away with the income tax. Right? Now, the Liberty Amendment did gather some steam. I got to know Willis Stone quite a bit, and I asked him one time if he was in favor of a constitutional convention, and he went like this, "Oh no, nobody's stupid enough to think of that." And that was in 1968. He said that. And he continued to promote his Liberty Amendment. He's passed on now, and the Liberty Amendment is pretty much a dead issue. But he had a good idea. Now, a lot of the amendments, a lot of the proponents of a con-con, call it what they will. They call it a compact for America. They call it a convention of the states. But it's always a con-con. When you boil it down, it's a con-con. Right? They will come up with the balanced budget amendment. Right? We got to have a balanced budget amendment. Okay. But expecting government officials to honor an amendment when they already do not honor the Constitution makes no sense at all to me. Right? That's one of the biggest arguments against this kind of stuff. Right? Some of the balanced budget amendments will allow 60% in Congress to override it. Well, that wouldn't be too hard. Some call for tax increases if budget isn't balanced, even steering taxing authority to the executive branch, which is, again, terrible. Right? Some say a budget doesn't have to be balanced if there's a war or a national security threat. All kinds of holes. Every balanced budget amendment that I've read has all of these kinds of holes in it. Right? More of them. Some say its provisions wouldn't take effect for 5 years, meaning more trillions added to the already enormous debt in those 5 years. Some say the way to get around the deficit problem is to declare some expenditures off budget. That would be cute, wouldn't it? Right? We got a balanced budget amendment because we didn't put all these things in the budget. Now, BBA's balanced budget amendments generally ignore the enormous deficit already accumulated, 17 trillion, and excuse me, on that I agree again with Farris. Is probably closer to $200 trillion, right? Look what we're doing to our kids and our grandchildren, right? Now, there are 2 ways to balance the budget, and I don't know of any others besides these 2. The first is Congress can cut spending for unconstitutional programs. And the second is Congress can nullify laws and programs, right? What unused power in the Constitution? Article 1, Section 7. All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. The power of the purse resides in the House of Representatives. And we tell people, look, if you're going to run for office, don't run for U.S. Senate, don't run for president, don't run for state office, run for U.S. Congress and use Article 1, Section 8, where if you get enough, you get a majority, you can stop federal involvement in education, federal involvement in housing, federal involvement in medicine, federal involvement in on and on and on you go. The power of the purse is in the House of Representatives. And I can recall one time saying that to a congressman, and he said to me, "Is that really in there?" And I went, "Oh no, oh no." That's very important, right? And that can be done. 50% plus one can stop the Department of Education, can stop Obamacare, can stop all different kinds of things. It's in the Constitution. All they have to do is realize that power and then start to use it. What are some unconstitutional federal programs? Foreign aid. Show me foreign aid in the Constitution of the United States. Not there. Education, housing, energy, medical care, and on you go. Undeclared wars, and so forth. All kinds of unconstitutional federal programs that can be stopped by 50% plus one in the House of Representatives. Now, let's contrast proposals here. My proposal says, let's rely on the Constitution. 218 in the House, that's a majority. There are 435, so 218 is a majority. 51 in the Senate, or none. If the House just uses its power as the Constitution gives it that power, then you don't need the Senate. But if you had 51 in the Senate to go along with it, that would help, right? And there's no role for state ratifications. So that's a rather simple procedure, isn't it? Now go to the balanced budget amendment. You need 290 in the House, you need 67 in the Senate, and you need 38 state ratifications. So which is the best way to opt? 218 in the House and nobody else? Or 290 in the House, 67 in the Senate, and 38 state ratifications? I mean, that's so simple. I mean, how can anybody want to propose a balanced budget amendment when you have the power already there? Okay. Now, one of the great lies in our country is that the job of the Supreme Court is to interpret the Constitution. No, no. In fact, I wrote a booklet, and it's, Kip, why don't you hold up one over there? Restoring the Rights of the States and the People under the Constitution. It gets into this and a lot more. And the great villain in this whole thing was John Marshall. John Marshall was appointed the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by John Adams a few hours before John Adams left the White House. And John Marshall held the position of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court longer than anybody else. And he did a lot of harm, let me tell you. It's all in that little book, and I hope some people... Now, it is an error to believe that the assignment of the Supreme Court and lower federal courts is to interpret the Constitution. It's a big mistake, right? Their task is to rule that a measure is or is not constitutional. And most decisions should state it's none of the federal government's business and hand it back down to the states and to the people themselves. We wrongly allow leaders to make a federal case out of virtually everything, right? Now, every time I say that, I think of my mother. My mother, who was not politically astute. And she would always say to me and to my brother and my sisters, don't make a federal case out of it. Maybe you've heard other people say that, right? Don't make a federal case out of it. Well, unfortunately, we see people making a federal case out of everything, and it should not be. The job of the Supreme Court is not to interpret the Constitution, it's to obey the Constitution and to make sure everybody else does.
That's right.
Now, rescissions, all right? Beginning in 1988, the John Birch Society and a few allies persuaded state legislators in 18 states to rescind all previous con-con calls. There were con-con calls for a balanced budget amendment. There was con-con calls against abortion, con-con calls against flag burning, con-con calls for all different kinds of things, right? And it was just cluttering up the whole thing. So we persuaded 18 different states to rescind all previous con-con calls. And the states are listed there. Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, and so on. Florida originally did what we asked, what our members in Florida asked of them, but then they later issued a new balanced budget con-con call, right? Somebody else got to them, and we weren't as vigilant as we should have been. So rescission of a constitutional call for a con-con, a state call for a con-con, is certainly proper. But there are some people who say, no, you can't. You can't rescind once you've already made the move, which is ridiculous. Until there is a con-con, if you've made the call, you can rescind it, and that's certainly legal as far as we're concerned. Now, earlier I mentioned James Madison as being on my side of this, right? James Madison was opposed. Who was James Madison? Well, he was only the 4th president of the United States. He's the father of the Constitution, so named because he took the notes and he put everything together and he wrote out what the Constitution had, what the convention had decided upon. And a lot of his thinking is in the Federalist Papers. He is the author of the Bill of Rights. And he then became a member of Congress before he became the 4th president. And he's an opponent of another con-con. Why is he? Why is he? Well, in November 2 of 1788, now realize the Constitutional Convention was in 1787. And the federal government was begun shortly after that, right? Madison, in November 2 of 1788, said, having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under very propitious circumstances, I should tremble for the result of a second. Right? What were the propitious circumstances? Well, the membership of the people who were at the Constitutional Convention, led by George Washington. And George Washington had such stature that he would enter the room and everybody would just hush and quiet down. And he kept control on this thing and made sure that it didn't go too far or went where it should have gone and so forth. So those propitious circumstances, the likes of Jefferson and Madison and Washington and several of our founding fathers, how many people do we have that measure up that way today? Not too many, right? There might be some that are quietly going about their business. Maybe some of you have heard of a man named John Eidsmoe. John Eidsmoe is one of my favorites. He's a great thinker. Well, Madison, now, in Essay 40 of the Federalist Papers, Madison said, the authority given to conduct the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 was limited and was for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. He said that in the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers being the essays written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay for the farmers in New York State, that they would read what the Constitution was really all about and want their state to ratify it and become a part of the new constitutional system. I don't know how many college graduates I have suggested should read the Federalist Papers and have come back and told me it's too heavy for them. They can't handle it. Right? Sometimes you get a sentence that's a whole page long. But ladies and gentlemen, it's great thinking. I urge you, if you have never experienced the Federalist Papers, to do so. But my point is that Madison himself said that the purpose of the 1787 convention, the sole and express purpose, was to revise the Articles of Confederation. Right? They exceeded the mandate because they knew, as I know, that a constitutional convention is effectively a sovereign body. It can do whatever it wants, which is why the John Birch Society is opposed to a constitutional convention. Now, what do we recommend? We'll get to that before we finish, right? One of them is nullification. Congress enacted the Real ID Act in 2005, and most states said, nope, we're not going to do it. So the Real ID Act has never been enforced. Effectively, nullification, but they didn't use the term. Now that doesn't mean that the Real ID Act is over and finished completely. It will come back if we allow it to come back. Right? 24 states have refused to implement it in acts which qualify as nullification. Jefferson talked about nullification. He wrote the Kentucky resolutions. Now, Kentucky wanted to be a state, and so Kentucky had to impress the members of the U.S. Congress at the time that they were worthy to become a state. They were the 15th state, by the way. We know the 13. Most of us know the 13. How many know what the 14th state was? Vermont. Yeah, that's right. Vermont is one of the few states that was a republic before it became a state. Right? But anyhow, that's a side point. Jefferson in the Kentucky resolutions said that a nullification by those sovereignties, states, of all unauthorized acts done under the color of that instrument, the Constitution, is the rightful remedy. Right? Now, my good friend Tom Woods wrote a book called Nullification. I hope some of you have seen this. I hope some of you have read it. It's an examination of the process of nullification by the states. In other words, if the federal government comes along with something that is absolutely intolerable, then the state has the right to go ahead and nullify it and say, no, we're not going to obey. If I had my way, I'd be nullifying all kinds of things. Right? All right, the book by Tom Woods. His book has been praised by Judge Napolitano. I think he's a Jersey boy, isn't he? Columnist Walter Williams. Right? Barry Goldwater Jr., who is now in favor of a constitution with the Goldwater Institute in Phoenix. I called him. I've met him in the press, so I called him. And I said, well, there are people telling me that you're in favor of the Constitutional Convention. I hope that's not so. He said, well, it is so. I am very much in favor of it. I said, and I can't talk you out of it. He said, no, you can't talk me out of it. I said, okay, well, nice to chat with you. Bye. So he's in favor of it, even though he praises nullification. The John Birch Society is in favor of nullification. We would like to see some states start to do this, and there are numerous others who would also. Madison wrote in his notes on nullification in 1834, this is after he was the president, nullification of a law can belong rightfully to a single state as one of the parties of the Constitution, the state not ceasing to avow its adherence to the Constitution, the rest of it, in other words. So Madison was very much in favor of it. That's good. We got him on our side. So let's summarize. A con-con is constitutionally legitimate, but a con-con cannot be limited. Wisdom has prevented creating a con-con for the past 200 plus years. We had one in the history of our country, and out of it came the Constitution of the United States. Chancing that that would happen again is foolish. So alternatives to a con-con. We got to force Congress to abide by its solemn oath, each one of them, and then nullification of unconstitutional measures by the states. And you don't even have to call it nullification. I don't think anybody used the word nullification when they stopped the Real ID Act. But it was nullification. All right, a closing comment from Judge Robert Bork, now deceased. It is my view that a federal constitutional convention could not be limited to a single issue. The original Philadelphia Convention went well beyond the purpose for which it was called, and nobody has suggested the Constitution is a nullity for that reason, right? Good thinking, right? He liked the Constitution. He saw that it had come out of a constitutional convention to revise the articles, but they went farther than just revising the articles. Okay, let's go back where we started. Lost awareness. America became great not because of what government did, but because of what government was prevented from doing by the Constitution. I hope everybody will remember that, right? Now we have a book table over there. We have the Constitution and the Declaration. We have my booklet called Restoring the Rights. We have JBS Realities and Myths. Some of you are maybe first time you've ever come to a John Birch Society presentation. There's a lot of dirty things that have been said about us, so we put together a booklet called Realities versus Myths. And they have America and the United Nations. We got to get out of the UN. William Buckley Jr., the Pied Piper for the establishment. And there we have it. Ladies and gentlemen, there's the John Birch Society's position on a con-con. We don't want a con-con. We like the Constitution. What we do want is those that we elect forced to abide by it. Thank you very much.